The sound of shattering glass echoed through the small cabin as Grace Zimmerman stared at the fragments of her mother's antique vase scattered across the wooden floor. Her hands trembled, not from the loss of the heirloom, but from the letter she'd just received. Her husband would not be returning from his cattle drive. May 1872 had brought her nothing but grief, first with another month passing without a child in her womb, and now the news that Daniel had been killed in a stampede near the Kansas border. Grace sank to her knees, unmindful of the glass cutting into her skin as she clutched the wrinkled paper to her chest. At 26, she was now a widow in the unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Territory, miles from the nearest town, with winter approaching and no one to help manage the small ranch her husband had built with such pride. Mrs. Zimmerman. A deep voice called from outside, followed by a knock on the door frame. "It's Sheriff Taylor. I heard about Daniel. Thought you might need some supplies." Grace wiped her tears and pulled herself to her feet, brushing glass shards from her skirt. "Come in, Sheriff." The aging lawman entered, hat in hand, his eyes widening at the sight of blood on her dress. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said, turning away to hide her face. "Just a small cut." Sheriff Taylor set down a sack of provisions on the rough-hewn table. "The town's taken up a collection." "Not much, but should help you get by until you decide what to do." "Thank you," Grace managed, her voice hollow, "but I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." The sheriff looked around the cabin doubtfully. "No offense, Mrs. Zimmerman, but winter's coming. A woman alone out here." He shook his head. "Your family back east." "I have no family," she interrupted. "And Daniel built this place for us, for the children we were going to have." Her voice caught. "I won't abandon it." After the sheriff left, Grace sat by the window watching the sun set over the mountains. For 5 years, she and Daniel had tried for a child. 5 years of hopes raised and dashed, of watching other women in town cradle their babies while her arms remained empty. Now her husband was gone too, leaving her truly alone. That night, Grace cried until she had no tears left, then rose before dawn to feed the chickens and milk the cow. Daniel's horse nickered from the small stable, and she patted his neck, whispering, "It's just us now, Thunder." Days turned to weeks as Grace struggled to maintain the ranch. She sold most of the cattle, keeping only what she could manage. The money would last through winter if she was careful. Some folks from town occasionally rode out to check on her, bringing supplies or offering help with heavier chores. But as November's chills settled over the land, the visits grew less frequent. One bitter cold morning in early December, Grace awoke to the sound of thunder whinnying frantically. Grabbing Daniel's rifle from above the door, she pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. A man lay face down in the snow just beyond her gate, his horse standing nearby, head lowered against the wind. Without hesitation, Grace set down the rifle and rushed forward. "Sir, can you hear me?" She turned him over, revealing a face young but weathered with several days' growth of beard. Blood stained the snow beneath him, seeping from a wound in his side. He was alive, but barely. Grace wasn't strong enough to carry him, but she managed to drag him across the yard and into the cabin, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. Once inside, she cut away his coat and shirt, revealing an ugly bullet wound that had festered. For 3 days, Grace nursed the stranger, cleaning his wound, forcing broth between his cracked lips, and keeping the fever at bay with cool cloths and willow bark tea. When he finally opened his eyes startlingly blue against his tanned skin, she was dozing in the chair beside the bed. "Am I dead?" He croaked, causing her to jolt awake. "No, though you nearly were," she replied, reaching for the water cup. "Who shot you?" The man took a sip before answering. "Name's Deacon Vance. Got ambushed by road agents near Blackwater Pass. They took my money but missed my heart." He tried to sit up, wincing. "Sorry to trouble you, madam." "Grace Zimmerman," she offered. "And it's no trouble, couldn't leave you to freeze." As December deepened, Deacon slowly regained his strength. Grace learned he was a former cavalry soldier turned cowboy, drifting from ranch to ranch since the war ended. He'd been heading north looking for work when the robbers struck. "Your husband won't mind me staying till I can ride?" Deacon asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Grace stared into the flames. "My husband died last spring. Cattle drive accident." Deacon was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman. Please call me Grace." She looked up to find his eyes on her, filled with a gentleness that made her chest tighten. "It's just me here now." As soon as Deacon could stand without assistance, he insisted on earning his keep. Despite Grace's protests, he began repairing things around the cabin: the leaky roof, the broken step, the loose shutters that had banged all through autumn. When the next snowstorm hit, trapping them inside for days, Grace found herself grateful for his company. They passed the time with stories. Deacon told her of growing up in Ohio, of fighting in the war, of the open country he'd seen in his travels. Grace shared memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of meeting Daniel at a church picnic, of their journey west to start a new life. "Did you and your husband have children?" Deacon asked one night. Grace set down her mending. "No, we tried for years, but—" She swallowed hard. "It wasn't meant to be, I suppose." Deacon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My sister had the same trouble. Then after 6 years, twins came along out of nowhere." He smiled at the memory. "Sometimes life surprises you." "Not always in good ways," Grace murmured. "No," he agreed. "Not always." By Christmas, Deacon was strong enough to ride into town for supplies. Grace gave him the list and what money she could spare, watching anxiously as he disappeared into the snowy landscape. Part of her feared he wouldn't return. Why would he? A drifter with no ties to her or this place. But return he did, the wagon loaded not only with flour, coffee, and other necessities, but also with a small pine tree and a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Grace asked as he set up the tree in the corner of the cabin. "Christmas," Deacon replied simply. "Thought you might like some cheer." That night, after a supper of rabbit stew, Deacon handed her the package. "It's not much," he said, suddenly looking boyish despite his 30 years. Grace unwrapped it to find a beautiful blue woolen scarf. "How did you traded my father's pocket watch," he admitted. "Worth it to see you smile." Grace hadn't realized she was smiling until he mentioned it. Something warm unfurled in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a bundle from her sewing basket. Inside was a new shirt she'd made from fabric left over from curtains. Deacon held it up, genuine pleasure lighting his face. "No one's made me something in years." Their hands touched as he took the gift, and neither pulled away immediately. The air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken words. January brought brutal cold and a wolf pack that threatened the livestock. Deacon built a sturdy pen near the cabin and took to sleeping in the stable to guard the animals. Grace worried about him in the cold, but admired his determination to protect what was hers. One night, the wolves came closer than ever. Grace was awakened by Thunder's frightened neighing and the crack of Deacon's rifle. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran outside. The sight that met her eyes froze her in place. Deacon stood in the yard, rifle raised, as 3 wolves circled him. A 4th lay dead in the snow. "Grace, get back inside," he shouted, not taking his eyes off the predators. Instead, she ran to the porch and grabbed Daniel's shotgun. The blast scared off 2 of the wolves, and Deacon's next shot dropped the 3rd. In the sudden silence, they stared at each other across the moonlit yard, breath fogging in the cold air. "That was foolish," Deacon said as they retreated to the cabin. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Grace retorted, stoking the fire. "I couldn't just stay inside while you," she broke off, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the intensity in his eyes. "While I what?" he asked softly. "While you faced them alone," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Deacon reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not used to anyone caring if I live or die." Grace caught his hand before he could withdraw it. "Well, I care." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, Grace saw her own wonder mirrored in Deacon's expression. "I should go," he said hoarsely. She held onto his sleeve. "Stay." That night, Grace felt alive in a way she hadn't since before Daniel's death, perhaps ever. In Deacon's arms, she found not just passion but a tenderness that made her heart ache. Afterward, lying beside him in the darkness, guilt crept in. "I loved my husband," she whispered. "I don't want you to think." "I know," Deacon said, drawing her closer, "and I respect that. But Grace, loving someone in the past doesn't mean you can't find love again." "Is that what this is?" she asked, vulnerable. "Love?" Deacon was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he said, "I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you. If that's not love, then I don't know what is." February brought thaws and freezes, making travel difficult. Deacon moved from the stable into the cabin permanently, though they were careful to maintain propriety when anyone from town visited. Sheriff Taylor raised an eyebrow at finding Deacon there, but said nothing beyond a warning look that Grace pretended not to notice. As March winds blew, bringing hints of spring, Grace realized her monthly courses hadn't come. At first, she dismissed it as stress or poor nutrition from the hard winter. But as weeks passed and her dresses grew tighter, hope began to bloom. She said nothing to Deacon, fearing disappointment. She'd had false hopes before, with Daniel, moments when she thought she might be with child, only to have those hopes dashed. But when morning sickness struck in April, she could no longer deny the possibility. "Deacon," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Sound serious." "I'm with child," she said simply, watching his face. For a moment he looked stunned. Then a slow smile spread across his features, lighting his eyes. "A baby? You're sure?" Grace nodded, tears threatening. "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." Deacon fell to his knees before her, taking her hands in his. "Grace Zimmerman, I've been trying to find the right time to ask this, and I reckon there's no better time than now. Will you marry me?" Joy bubbled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married in the town church in May, exactly 1 year after Grace had received the news of Daniel's death. Some townspeople whispered about the hasty wedding and Grace's slightly rounded figure, but Sheriff Taylor stood as witness with a smile that silenced the gossips. As summer progressed, Grace's belly grew, and so did Deacon's devotion. He expanded the cabin, adding a small room for the baby, and took odd jobs in town to save money. At night, he would place his hand on her stomach, marveling at the movements of their child. "Never thought I'd be a father," he confessed one evening. "Always figured I'd die with my boots on somewhere alone." "And now?" Grace asked, covering his hand with hers. "Now I can't imagine any life but this one with you." On a crisp October morning, after 18 hours of labor attended by the midwife from town, Grace gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, after Deacon's mother. "She's perfect," Deacon whispered, cradling the tiny bundle. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and your beautiful eyes." Grace watched them, exhausted but filled with a happiness she'd never thought to experience. For years, she had yearned for a child, had felt broken and incomplete when pregnancy eluded her. Now, watching her husband hold their daughter, she felt whole. Winter came again, but this time the cabin was filled with the sounds of Elizabeth's coos and cries. Deacon proved to be a natural father, walking the floor with the baby when she was colicky, singing old cavalry songs to lull her to sleep. "Never thought I'd see Deacon Vance domesticated," Sheriff Taylor remarked during a visit. "You've worked a miracle, Mrs. Vance." Grace smiled, watching Deacon show Elizabeth the snowflakes falling outside the window. "No miracle, Sheriff, just love." By spring, Grace noticed something remarkable. Deacon laughed more than anyone she'd ever known. His joy in fatherhood was boundless, and his laughter filled their home from dawn till dusk. Elizabeth, sensing his delight, began laughing too, her baby giggles causing even Grace's most serious moments to dissolve into mirth. "I never expected this," Grace confided to Martha Jenkins, the midwife, who had become a friend. "After Daniel died, I thought my life was over. I certainly never imagined I'd find love again, or have a child, or hear so much laughter in this cabin." Martha patted her hand. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, Deacon expanded their ranch operations. With money saved and a loan from the bank, he bought more cattle and hired 2 hands to help manage the herd. Grace took pride in seeing the Vance brand on growing numbers of livestock, knowing they were building a legacy for their daughter. In the summer of 1875, when Elizabeth was nearly 3, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This time, there was no hesitation in sharing the news with Deacon. "Another baby." He picked her up and spun her around, laughing. "Beth's going to be a big sister." Elizabeth, not fully understanding but infected by her father's enthusiasm, clapped her hands. "Baby," she exclaimed, pointing at Grace's still flat stomach. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Elizabeth chase fireflies in the yard, Deacon grew contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How different my life would have been if those road agents had been better shots," he said quietly. "I'd have died in the snow, never knowing you, never holding Beth, never feeling this. Complete." Grace squeezed his hand. "And I would still be alone, thinking my chance for happiness died with Daniel." Deacon kissed her forehead. "Seems like we saved each other." In December, Grace gave birth to twin boys, James and Thomas. The cabin, now expanded to a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a large kitchen, was filled to bursting with life and noise. 3 children, Grace marveled as she nursed James while Thomas slept in the cradle beside her. "After all those years of waiting, now I have 3. Deacon, who was entertaining Elizabeth with a wooden horse he'd carved, looked up with a grin. "And who says we have to stop at 3? Grace laughed, the sound mingling with Elizabeth's giggles and the soft snuffling of the twins. "Let me recover from these 2 before you start planning more, Cowboy." Life settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple joys. Deacon proved as adept at running the ranch as he had been at drifting, and the Vance property prospered. Grace took pride in her vegetable garden and preserves, which won ribbons at the county fair 3 years running. Elizabeth started school in town, riding there on her own pony, a gift from her father for her 6th birthday. The twins, inseparable and mischievous, followed their sister everywhere, much to her alternating delight and frustration. When Elizabeth was 8 and the twins 5, another daughter joined the family. They named her Hope, for what she represented to both of them, the enduring belief that life could always begin anew. 4 children, Deacon mused as they watched all of them playing in the yard one summer evening in 1880. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be sitting on my own porch with a beautiful wife and 4 children, I'd have laughed them out of town. And if someone had told me after Daniel died that a half-dead cowboy would stumble onto my property and fill my life with more joy than I could imagine, I'd have thought them mad, Grace replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Inside the house, photographs chronicled their journey: Grace and Deacon's wedding day, Elizabeth as a newborn, the twins' first birthday, Hope's christening. Alongside these were older images: Grace and Daniel on their wedding day, Deacon in his cavalry uniform, both of their families from back east. They didn't hide the past from their children. Elizabeth knew that Daniel had built the original cabin, and that the meadow where wildflowers grew was his final resting place. The children placed flowers there on special days, honoring the man whose death had, in a roundabout way, brought their parents together. As the years passed, the Vance Ranch became known throughout the territory for its fine horses and cattle. Deacon's fair dealings and Grace's hospitality made them respected figures in the community. Their home was often filled with neighbors and friends, drawn by the warmth and laughter that seemed to permeate the walls. In 1885, when Elizabeth was 13, she asked her mother a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Ma, were you sad when you couldn't have babies with your first husband?" Grace, who was kneading bread while Hope played with dolls nearby, paused. "Yes, sweetheart, I was very sad. Back then, I thought having a child was the most important thing in the world. And now?" Elizabeth pressed, wise beyond her years. Grace smiled, looking out the window where Deacon was teaching the twins to rope. "Now I know that loving and being loved is what matters most. The children are a blessing, but the love came first." That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace shared the conversation with Deacon as they sat by the fire. "Smart girl, our Beth," he commented, taking a sip of coffee. "Sees right to the heart of things." "Like her father," Grace said fondly. Deacon set down his cup and took her hand. "You know, there are still days I wake up and can't believe this is my life. That I get to love you, watch our children grow, build something that will outlast us." "I know what you mean," Grace replied. "Sometimes I remember that winter before you came, how empty and cold everything was. I was just going through the motions, barely living. And now," Grace leaned over to kiss him, still feeling the same spark after all these years. "Now I'm living every moment fully." The next year brought changes as the railroad finally reached their part of Montana. The town grew rapidly, and with it came new opportunities and challenges. Deacon was elected to the town council, his straightforward manner and fair mind making him popular among both old-timers and newcomers. Grace, meanwhile, started a small business selling her preserves and baked goods to the general store. The extra income went into a fund for the children's education. Elizabeth already talked of attending college back east, a dream her parents were determined to help her achieve. In the spring of 1888, when Elizabeth was 16, a letter arrived that changed the family's trajectory once again. Deacon's sister Sarah, widowed and ailing, asked if her son Robert could come live with them. At 15, the boy needed guidance that Sarah, with her failing health, couldn't provide. "Of course he must come," Grace said without hesitation. "He's family." When Robert arrived, sullen and grief-stricken over his mother's illness, it was Elizabeth who broke through his reserve. The cousins formed a bond that surprised everyone, with Elizabeth's confident optimism drawing Robert out of his shell. By summer's end, Robert was helping with the ranch work alongside the twins, now 13 and already skilled horsemen. Hope, at 8, appointed herself Robert's personal guide, showing him all her favorite spots on the property and chattering endlessly about school and friends. "It's good to see him smile," Deacon remarked one evening as they watched Robert teaching Hope to skip stones across the creek. Sarah's letter said he hadn't done much of that since his father died. "This place has a way of healing broken hearts," Grace said softly. "It certainly healed mine." The following year brought both joy and sorrow. Sarah passed away in March, leaving Robert truly orphaned but secure in the knowledge that he had a home with the Vances. In June, Elizabeth graduated at the top of her class and was accepted to a women's college in Massachusetts, with a partial scholarship to help with expenses. "I'm proud of you, Beth," Deacon told her the night before she was to leave. "Your mother and I always wanted you children to have opportunities we didn't." Elizabeth hugged him fiercely. "I'll make you prouder still, Pa. I'm going to study medicine and come back to help people here." The day of Elizabeth's departure was emotional for everyone. The twins tried to hide their tears with bluster. Hope clung to her sister until the last possible moment, and Robert promised to write every week. Grace and Deacon stood arm in arm as the stagecoach pulled away, both crying unashamedly. "She'll be back," Deacon said, his voice rough. "I know," Grace replied, "but the house will be quieter without her." "Not for long," Deacon grinned, nodding toward where the twins were already arguing over who would get to use Elizabeth's desk for their schoolwork. That night, lying in bed, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 20 years ago, I came west with Daniel, full of dreams about the family we'd have. Then years passed without children, and I thought that dream was lost forever." Deacon pulled her closer. "And now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. 4 wonderful children, 5, counting Robert, a thriving ranch, a husband who still makes my heart race after all these years." "Not bad for a half-dead cowboy who stumbled into your yard," Deacon chuckled. "Not bad at all," Grace agreed, kissing him softly. The years continued to bring changes. Robert, who had inherited his uncle's way with horses, took over the training of the ranch's stock. The twins, different in temperament but united in their love of the land, expanded the cattle operation into neighboring territories. Hope, bright and determined like her mother, excelled in school and set her sights on becoming a teacher. Elizabeth made good on her promise, returning after medical school to establish a practice in town. When she married the new schoolteacher in 1895, the celebration at the Vance Ranch lasted 3 days, with guests coming from as far as Denver. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked Deacon as they watched their daughter dance with her new husband. "When you were lying wounded in the snow that day?" "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I was just hoping to live till morning." "And instead you got a lifetime," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "The best kind of lifetime," Deacon replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "One filled with love and laughter." In 1900, as a new century dawned, Grace and Deacon found themselves grandparents when Elizabeth gave birth to twin girls. The Vance Ranch, now one of the largest in the territory, became the gathering place for an expanding family that included not only their children and grandchildren, but also the families of the ranch hands who had worked alongside them for decades. On Christmas Eve that year, with the house full to bursting with family, friends, and delicious smells, Grace slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The stars shone brilliantly in the clear Montana sky, and the snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked to the edge of the porch. Deacon joined her a few minutes later, draping a warm shawl around her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Vance." Grace leaned into him, drawing strength and warmth from his solid presence as she had for nearly 30 years. "I was thinking about how empty this place was before you came. Just me rattling around in that little cabin, trying to hold on to something that was already gone." "And now," he asked, echoing the question he'd asked so many times over the years. Grace turned to face him, taking in the silver in his hair, the laugh lines around his eyes, the strong hands that had built their home and held their children. "Now there's so much life here I can barely contain it all in my heart." Inside, someone started playing the piano, and the sound of their family singing carols drifted out into the night. Deacon pulled Grace closer, swaying slightly to the music. "Remember our first Christmas together? Just the two of us in that cabin, with that scraggly little pine tree I brought back from town." Grace nodded against his chest. "You gave me that blue scarf. I still have it. And you gave me hope," Deacon said simply. "Hope for a life I never thought I'd have." As they stood there in the starlight, surrounded by the sounds of the family they'd created together, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the young widow she'd been, and the drifting cowboy who'd found his way to her door. For the years of struggle and the moments of joy. For the children who had finally filled her arms and her heart. "Come inside," she said, taking Deacon's hand. "Let's not miss a moment of this." They returned to the warmth of their home, where Hope was leading the youngest grandchildren in a lively rendition of Jingle Bells. The twins were arguing good-naturedly over the best way to carve the turkey. Robert was stoking the fire, and Elizabeth was rocking her newborn daughter to sleep. As Grace crossed the threshold, she caught Deacon's eye and saw in his expression the same wonder she felt that all of this abundance, all of this love and laughter, had grown from the darkest moment of her life. That the empty cabin of her widowhood had transformed into this vibrant home, filled with generations of Vances who would carry their legacy forward. "Grandma, come sing with us," called one of the children, and Grace moved toward the piano, still holding Deacon's hand. This, she thought, was the true miracle, not just the children she'd longed for, but the unexpected joy they'd brought. The way one chance encounter had changed everything. The way love, once allowed to take root, could grow beyond all imagining. And as her family gathered around, voices rising in harmony, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought her here to this home, this family, this life overflowing with the laughter she had never expected.